promotes a model of schools we call 21st century school systems, or systems that provide parents more choice and give schools more autonomy in return for more accountability. Our research shows that in urban America, public school systems that do this produce the most rapid improvement in student performance. The purpose of today's webinar is to discuss the growing movement for a constitutional right to quality public education in America at the state level. Understanding individual states have control over how they provide public education to its system, to its citizens, we will learn from experts from around the country about the impact the right to a quality public education would have on closing racial and economic achievement gaps in America. Let's get started. Before I ask my panelists to introduce themselves, we want to find out who you are in the audience. This survey before you is going to tell us who we're speaking with. So you have the opportunity to choose one of these categories, and please choose a category you most identify with. To be honest, I identify with at least 2 or 3 of these personally. And so whether you're identified as a parent, an educator, a funder, a journalist, an advocate, or a policymaker, as it relates to this conversation, please let us know which group you most identify with, and then we'll share that with the audience and share that with our panel in a second. Without further ado, I want to start all the way from the West Coast. Dr. Pedro Nogueira, introduce yourself to our panelists and to our community today.
Thanks, Curtis. My name is Pedro Nogueira. I am the Dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC. Been in the field of education for over 30 years as a teacher, policymaker, researcher, and now as an administrator at school. So glad to be with all of you today.
Thank you. While coming from the West Coast, I believe you're on the East Coast today. Mayor Villaraigosa, would you introduce yourself to us?
Antonio Villaraigosa, 41st Mayor of the City of Los Angeles, and a beneficiary of both the Catholic school and public school education, committed to this notion that we need to make America's schools the place again where you can reach for the stars and follow your dreams.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Ben Austin, also in California. Introduce yourself today.
Ben Austin with Education Civil Rights Now. We're a national nonprofit and we support advocacy in different states to establish a constitutional right to a high quality public education for all public school students in a way that empowers all public school parents with a seat at the table to hold politicians accountable and advocate for the interests of kids.
Great. Linda Jacobson, glad you can join us. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Linda Jacobson. I'm a reporter for the 74. I cover primarily federal policy, but also a lot of issues that have national scope, which this obviously does. Thank you.
Last but not least, we have the Honorable Judge Alan Page from Minnesota. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Hi, my name is Alan Page, retired Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, and along with my late wife, Diane Sims Page, founder of the Page Education Foundation, which has as its purpose motivating, assisting, and encouraging Minnesota's young men and women of color in the pursuit of post-secondary education by providing financial assistance and by requiring our paid scholars to serve young children kindergarten through 8th grade as tutors, mentors, and role models.
Thank you so much. An amazing panel, as I'm sure of you all who listened in can tell. Before we get started, can we show our survey results and see who's in the audience? Nearly half of the folks who responded are advocates, people who are fighting for this very right. We also have the second biggest contingency are the educators, with parents coming in third place. So think about that as you are answering these questions and understanding that those who are on this call, those who are watching this live, are folks who are in their communities trying to advocate for the best education for their children. We are having this conversation in the wake of the commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And we are having this conversation in many ways to reinstill the understanding that the fight for civil rights in America did not end with the assassination of Dr. King. Every day, men and women around this country are fighting for the very rights in many ways that Dr. King and those in the civil rights movement did as well. And so as we talk about this conversation, you are going to hear definite relationship to the movement, not only in the past, today, and also moving forward. Without further ado, I want to have my buddy Ben talk about sort of, let's talk about this national conversation, this national movement around a constitutional right to a quality public education. How did the Education Civil Rights Now movement start? How did we get here?
Well, thank you, Curtis. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you, the 74. Politicians have been talking about education as a civil right since long before Brown versus Board of Education. I think the latest, the modern movement around translating that soundbite into an actionable civil right for all children, especially all children of color and low-income children in America, really came out of the pandemic. As everybody on this panel knows, and before the pandemic shuttered schools for well over a year, 20% of Black students in America were reading at grade level. But the pandemic, I think, shined a light on these inequities in a way that made them at least politically indefensible. And parents began organizing across race and class and other lines of traditional difference because they began to recognize they have more in common with each other across these dividing lines than they do with defenders of an unjust status quo. I mean, I will tell you that parents at my own daughter's school, my daughters last spring graduated from their public schools that they hadn't attended full time for well over a year. And I'm as privileged as they come when it comes to public school parents. My parents at my own daughter's school who marched with the teachers union 2 years ago during their strike watched from the sidelines as they negotiated away 12 million instructional hours during the pandemic and then justified it with an Orwellian declaration that there is no such thing as learning loss. These same parents and other parents organized to file a number of different lawsuits against their school district. In this case, it was against the LAUSD. And the LAUSD's response really said the quiet part out loud that I think sets the table for this conversation. They said that because students do not have a right to a quality public education, the LAUSD is under no legal obligation to provide one, and parents have no standing to challenge school reopening policies or anything else. We get what we get and we don't get upset. And bringing it back to where you started it, Curtis, with Dr. King, he writes in his letter from Birmingham jail that a law is unjust if it is inflicted upon a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, has no part in enacting or devising that law. And I think King's test gets to the heart of the problem, that disenfranchised students who are denied the right to vote in places like Los Angeles, many of their parents are also denied the right to vote, but students can't vote. Parents don't have lobbyists. And so in the face of special interest opposition, politicians aren't always incentivized to put the interests of students first, especially students of color. And so a constitutional mandate, establishing a constitutional North Star, saying that whatever else, we're gonna put students first for realsies, not with our fingers crossed behind our backs. As we reopen our schools again, the question is, are we gonna just rebuild a racist status quo ante, or are we gonna actually reimagine them in the ways that we really only talk about in discussions like this? I think establishing that kind of constitutional North Star is an important and a foundational first step.
Thank you. And that's a great start. And I just want to warn the audience, you're going to hear the term quality a lot, and in some cases, high quality. And so we want to dig a little deeper into that, particularly as it relates to public education. Every child in America has access to a public education if they choose, but this fight seems to draw a line when it comes to the term quality. Dr. Nogueira, do we have in this country a universal definition of quality education? And if so, what is it? We
don't have that universal definition. There are some states that the courts have said must define adequacy, which starts to get at the issue of quality. But no, there's not. And if you look around the country, what we see very clearly is that wherever poor children are concentrated, school failure is most likely. And that's because we don't provide adequate resources to those schools. And so here's where I will differ with Ben. That's not primarily a local matter. Local communities don't have the tax revenue to ensure that their kids can get a quality education. This civil rights have always been defined as federal and by extension state requirements. And so it's the federal government and the state that must step up. The Brown decision, which in many ways is our first major attempt at connecting civil rights to education, really had far-reaching effects on our whole society. So it set precedent for ending discrimination in housing, voting rights, employment, et cetera. But in education, it didn't live up to the promise of the Supreme Court decision because we didn't go far enough. We said at all deliberate speed. And then the federal government pulled back, and it was left to local communities to decide whether or not they were going to integrate their schools. Well, what we see today is that not only are schools in many parts of the country still segregated by race, but also by socioeconomic status. So what we really need to push for is to think of our schools the way we think of our highways, right? Think if you're driving through a poor neighborhood on an interstate highway, the highway doesn't suddenly start to fall apart. The same standards apply wherever that highway is. And that should be the way the schools are. It shouldn't matter where you live. Every school should be equipped with laboratories, with libraries, with well-trained teachers so that every child has the opportunity in education. That's not the case in America today.
I just wanted to very quickly agree with everything Dr. Noguera said. And the genesis of this does begin with the fanfare around the unanimous Brown versus Board of Education. But as you were referencing, Doctor, about 15 years later, in a lesser known, more narrow case, 5-4 case, Rodriguez versus San Antonio, the Supreme Court essentially said, never mind, we had our fingers crossed behind our backs. Thurgood Marshall, who was the NAACP attorney in Brown, wrote a powerful dissent as a justice on that court that predicted everything that happened. He said that if children, especially children of color, are left without constitutional protections to the proclivities of the political system, we're going to get what we have now. And so I agree with you, Doctor, that this is a federal and a state and a local problem. Mayor Villaraigosa has been on the front lines at the local level, and this could be there could be a federal statutory right to a high quality public education that applied to all schools that receive federal funding, or all Title I schools, and that's an important discussion to have as well.
Dr. Noguera, if I could come back to you and press you a little bit on this quality conversation and this idea, if someone were to give you the power to write this into law at the federal level, what are some of the benchmarks, what are some of the levers that you would say we should look at in order to determine whether a child has a quality education or simply an adequate one, which is a term we're going to address later?
So we need to rethink the way we approach standards. We've said, states have adopted standards for learning, but not standards for the conditions of learning, right? And if the states were to do that and hold themselves accountable for meeting those standards, we would end up with far more equitable schools than we have today. So you have to reframe standards the way we think about highways, or, I was going to say the water supply, but as we've seen in the case of Flint, there's no guarantee to clean water in this country either. So we need to make sure that the government is accountable for providing services to all people at a standard that meets the need.
And how are those standards, how's that environment distributed across race and class in America as it relates to those environments that these standards are placed on?
So as we saw in the Flint water case, when it was clear that the children, the people of Flint were being poisoned by lead in the water, the state was accountable. The state was the one who would, in fact, contaminated them and the community. So the state had to repair it. The state has to now compensate the families for the damages. I would say similarly that the states are accountable, should be accountable, because there is no constitutional right to an education in the US Constitution. It's in the state constitutions. And therefore, states must be accountable for ensuring adequacy and quality education.
Linda, I want to come to you. And I talked about it at the beginning. I believe both Dr. Noguera and Ben are talking about it as well. This idea of a state by state response, state by state solution in some cases. This fight looks different in different states. For those interested in bringing this fight to their state, it will most likely look different there as well. We're going to talk about this as well. What's happening in your state? Linda, you followed this fight in different states, and we have California and Minnesota represented, but there are others as well. How are the campaigns in Minnesota and California similar, and how are they different?
Thanks. The language in both the California and the Minnesota initiatives are similar. The proposal in Minnesota talks about the state having a paramount duty to ensure that students have a right to a quality education. And in California, the measure talks about putting students' interests first, and that any laws or regulations that don't do that would be in violation of the state constitution. I think another similarity is that both measures would face union opposition, likely because they're viewed as a threat to job protections for teachers, like tenure. Some critics also say that they would, open the door for vouchers. I think the major difference between the two initiatives right now is how they would be accomplished. In California, the effort would go straight to the voters as a ballot measure, and in Minnesota, the legislature would have to put the question on the ballot.
I believe there's also a difference in relates to funding in California as it relates to Minnesota as well, if it's passed. Ben, do you want to talk about that as well?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities and differences. I mean, the California language used a lot of the Minnesota language around establishing a constitutional right to a high quality public education that prepares students to participate in the economy, our democracy, and our society. That was from the Minnesota language. I think a few interesting differences. One is that Dr. Noguera talked earlier about funding. California builds on a precedent called Serrano v. Priest that establishes a right to equitable funding in California. And we also have a law called Local Control Funding Formula in California that also improves funding equity. Minnesota does not have that same framework. And so that is one difference in terms of how they're constructed. I think very quickly, one other quick difference is that California, deals with this fundamental question that Dr. Noguera was talking about how do you define quality? California and Minnesota deal with that differently. And I don't think there's one right answer. In California, it establishes that any law that does not put the interests of public school students first, especially low-income students and students of color, will be deemed to violate this right to a high-quality public education. So what that establishes is that because this is a fundamental right and a right under that triggers equal protection, that over time courts can define high quality under the California construct as meaning more than just putting students first, but it will never mean less. It establishes a floor that is a enforceable line from a court's perspective, where they're just calling balls and strikes in a similar way that courts have done with equal protection jurisprudence. If a law goes over the line and doesn't put students first, it would be repealed, and the legislature, not the courts, would decide what comes next. If it does put students first, it would stay on the books. Minnesota, and Justice Page can talk obviously more intelligently than I can about this, but Minnesota in part links their definition of high quality to, I believe it's statewide standards, which has its own advantages in that the legislature can evolve those standards over time as our understanding of essentially what it means to put students first evolves over time. And I think in neither case, and I think in both cases, the sort of drafters were really trying to think about this as constitutional framers. And I should say Mayor Villaraigosa was one of the drafters of the California framework. In that, you know, it's not like the framers of the First Amendment put a list of words in it that were protected, that it has to evolve over time as our language evolves over time. And similarly, we wouldn't want to lock in time a 2022 notion of educational quality, because hopefully in 2032 we'll be smarter about that. And so Minnesota does that by linking this statewide standards, which can evolve over time. And the California framework links it to, you got to put students first, which is a notion and a framework that can evolve over time as well.
Linda, before I come to Justice Page, I did want you to just touch on what's happening in other states. Similar campaigns, similar efforts at different sequences or parts of the process. What are you hearing about what's happening similar to this fight around a constitutional right to quality public education happening in other states outside of California and Minnesota?
There are two other states, Nevada and New Mexico, where this movement is still at pretty early stages, but there has been movement. In New Mexico, Senator Harold Pope Jr., who's the state's first Black senator, introduced a resolution last year that would give students a right to a high quality public education. There was a committee hearing. It didn't advance beyond that, but the session is still, you know, just getting started this year. So we'll see if that's reintroduced again. I think in Nevada, this has come up in connection to a school funding lawsuit called Shea versus Nevada. And there was testimony actually in which an attorney for the state talked about a scenario in which a classroom of third graders, you know, could reach as large as 60 children. And if that was the case, there would be no constitutional recourse. You know, parents couldn't do anything about it, basically. There was no guarantee against that. And that statement obviously attracted a lot of attention and has, you know, inspired some groups in the state to sort of consider next steps. They argue that this is the reason why the courts should be involved.
Thank you. Before we go forward, we want to come back to you, the audience, to survey you about a question, the question at hand today. And the question is, do you know, or does your state have a constitutional right to a quality public education? Wherever you are in this country, does your state have a constitutional right to a quality public education? Yes, no, or you're not sure. While you're doing that, I do want to come to Justice Page. This fight for a constitutional right to a quality public education in Minnesota has been led by a member of the judiciary at the highest level. Justice Page, former Supreme Court Justice Page in Minnesota, tell us about your efforts in Minnesota, and why is the current language in the Minnesota State Constitution, which currently provides for adequate and uniform system of public schools, not enough right now?
Well, let me begin by noting that adequate and uniform language is found in quite a few state constitutions across the country. It goes to system adequacy. It does not go to educational adequacy. And, you know, you talk about an adequate system so long as the system is adequate, no matter where you fall in terms of how you perform within that system. It doesn't matter, because you've received your right by having an adequate system. That system has led to these disparities that we see between middle class and wealthy white children and Black children, indigenous children, other children of color, and poor white children. And the fact is that those disparities are not sustainable. We cannot continue to have 20 to 30% of groups of children being the only ones who are performing at what we perceive to be grade level. We can't survive like that as a country. And so that's why back in 2019, Neil Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, and I sat down and proposed that we amend Minnesota's constitution to make education a civil right. And by civil right, we mean an individual right, so that every child, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, receives an education that will allow them to achieve their fullest potential, whatever that may be.
There are some in the audience who heard you say Federal Reserve of Minnesota, and their ears might have perked up because that's probably the first time they've heard Federal Reserve and public education in the same sentence. But as we discussed before, there is a connection. Can you talk about why this would be a priority of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota?
Well, the Federal Reserve has two responsibilities, congressionally mandated responsibilities. One of those is full employment. The most effective tool we have to ensure that people are prepared to work is education. And so they have a strong interest in ensuring the workforce of the future. And on the course we are on today, that workforce will not be there. And so they have an interest in ensuring that every child, as I say, is fully prepared. And, you know, we use that fully prepared language as the definition for what quality will look like. In time, you know, it'll what fully prepared looks like will be fleshed out. But our proposal has within itself the definition of quality. It also has within it a requirement that when we look at how the system is performing, we look at more than simply test scores. We have to look at how the system itself is performing. We don't do that now. And as best I can tell, it's not clear to me that we have ever held the system accountable, and that accountability is necessary. And then finally, you know, a right without remedies, it really isn't much of a right. And so because this is an individual right, and because the state has the paramount duty to fulfill that right, the legislative branch of our government will have a role, the executive will have a role, and our courts will have a role. And finally, you know, our language doesn't mention or talk about funding specifically, but the reality is that by making education a paramount duty of the state would have no higher responsibility than to ensure quality public schools. By making it a paramount duty, you can't fulfill that duty without funding, and without funding that meets that paramount need.
Thank you. And you mentioned the term system, and I'm reminded of a quote I heard recently that systems don't malfunction, particularly education in America. It is functioning quite perfectly because it is functioning the way it was created and producing the outputs that it was created to produce.
Our system is working exactly as it was designed to. Our constitutional provision was enacted in 1857. I don't need to remind everybody what this country looked like in 1857. That was the year that the United States Supreme Court decided Dred Scott, in which the Chief Justice of the United States said, and I'm paraphrasing here, those who had been imported as slaves had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. That's the context in which this language, our current language, was drafted and quite frankly intended to fulfill. Here we are in the 21st century. It is time we, it seems to me, that we, and I should note that, because we're talking about a system that has systemically and systematically left far too many children behind, you can't sort of fix it. You have to start over. And this gives us the opportunity, by making education a constitutional right, gives us the opportunity to design a system for the 21st century and into the future.
Thank you.
From the ground up.
We asked a survey question of the audience, particularly about whether your state had this constitutional right to a quality public education. The results, 16% of you all said that your state does, 44% said no, and about 40% said they weren't sure. And so this is good information to have, but also to research, to find out where your state stands, particularly and how your state defines quality. Mayor, we want to come to you. In California, the Constitution guarantees only a free public education. The amendment in California would add high quality education to the Constitution and assert that any law, regulation, policy, or official action that does not put the interest of students first be deemed to interfere with the right to a high quality education. Mayor, what impact would this amendment, if it passes, have on the city and citizens of Los Angeles?
First of all, thank you. And I think it's appropriate that the Progressive Policy Institute is hosting this. This notion of education as a civil right is not a conservative notion. It should be one that people who believe or call themselves progressives ought to be getting behind. Let me explain. First of all, it's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists. I am not an expert. I am a policymaker and probably had, with respect to improving our schools in Los Angeles, maybe the most successful run in the country, a 60% increase in the graduation rate. We took our schools from 1 out of 3 failing schools to 1 out of 10, from a 44% graduation rate to a 72% graduation rate. I took on a group of schools, the partnership schools, that had a 36% graduation rate and now have an 84% graduation rate. I first got involved in this issue, by the way, long before the drafting of this initiative. I led the walkouts in high school as a young man. I was involved in the issue of education for years. I worked for the teachers union for 8 years. I am unabashedly pro-union, pro-teacher. I was married to a teacher for 20 years. I saw her sacrifices. I saw her commitment to her kids, a commitment she still has, after more than almost more than 45 years of teaching. I can tell you this. I got involved in this issue, and I can tell you the impact it can have in the following ways. I got involved in this issue because everybody made a lot of ado about the fact that I had broken the glass ceiling. I was the first Latino elected as mayor in, I think, 133 years or something like that. And I said, everybody celebrating looked just like me. They and were serving me. And when I made the connection, how did I break this glass ceiling? I could read and write. I went to a Catholic school, which gave me a foundation, a public school that gave me a second chance, but put me in basic shop classes and the like, and ultimately graduated with a 1.4 grade point average and went to Mr. Noguera's former school, UCLA, on an affirmative action program. And I got involved in this issue, not because, my own kids were going to be impacted, but because kids like me, kids who grew up, home of domestic violence and alcoholism, poor, and didn't make it. So what could something like this do? It could transform our town. About 13, 14%, and, Pedro can correct me, something like that, of Latino and African-American kids are graduating from a 4-year institution, of higher learning. That is not a formula for success for LA, the second largest city in the country, the top 3 metropolitan economy in the world. That's not going to work for us in a world where information and knowledge are the currency of our economy. So our kids have to learn. And something I would add to what Pedro said we have to have, I think he said something to the effect that we have to have, the highway has to look the same, whether it goes through the poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood, and that's true. But I always say to this, our kids need more resources. Kids like me need more resources than my own kids. My kids, went to college because their father was, a college educated, because their mother was a teacher and college educated, because we were middle class now, not poor. Poor kids, start school, with much less of a vocabulary, thousands of words less than their counterparts who are middle class and, and the like. So we have to make sure that this high quality education, however you define it, is connected to accountability, is connected to the ability of people like parents to be able to say to the government, no, you say it's high quality, but the results don't reflect that. The results are that kids who are poor, mostly of color, in our urban schools aren't doing as well as kids in the suburban schools who are middle class, and of course, the kids of the rich who are in the private schools and the like. So it could transform our town. In the race for governor, LA County voted at 26%. San Francisco voted at 56%. Why? Kids are younger, they're poorer, they're less educated. Those are the people that don't vote. If our democracy is going to work, we need people that are educated, an educated citizenry. If our economy is going to bloom, we need people that can participate in that economy, not at the lower echelons, but in the middle and higher echelons as well. So it could transform our town. I saw it, I see it, and I know it, and that's why I got involved in this initiative. By the way, progressive, people love to talk, at a time when we're talking about, as an example, reparations. I tell people I'm all for it. Why don't we fix our schools so poor kids and kids of color, so Black kids get the same shot that white kids get in America? Progressives, why aren't we willing to challenge even our friends when they defend the status quo by saying, which they said to me for all the years I was in the legislature and the Speaker of the Assembly and Mayor of Los Angeles, well, you don't understand. These kids are poor. Their parents didn't get a college education. They don't even speak the language. Well, you're talking about me. And people like me and people like you. And guess what? Because you and I talked beforehand about our own experiences. Guess what? We can read and write, and so could these kids. We saw what can happen when we're willing to set high standards and make investments. Now in LA, we didn't make near the investments we needed to because it was the worst economy since the 1930s. But if we made those investments, had money follow the kid, and so the kids that are poorer and are behind, They need more resources. And I think that's the best way for progressives. And I say that with a bit of a smirk as you could, well, and, you know, dripping with irony, you know, love to talk about how progressive they are and are unwilling to take on this issue of inequality, which has as its base of where it came from, a lack of education, a lack of investing, you know, in everyone at the same levels that we invest at those who are at the highest echelons.
Curtis,
As you can see, I'm passionate about this issue.
I would just add about the mayor that he was for parent empowerment before parent empowerment was cool. Like when you were mayor, I remember you saying that teachers have every right to have a union, and you were a teachers union organizer, but parents should have a union too to advocate for the interests of children.
And we started that parent union and the parent trigger that said, you know, if schools aren't working and haven't been successful, parents ought to be able to turn them around. We had results, you know, but we're still seeing too many of our kids not make it. And that's unacceptable to me. And it ought to be unacceptable to everybody who calls themselves a progressive. It's time for us to wake up. If we want to address the fact that America's so rich and so poor at the same time, that we have a level of inequality that you see in nations much poorer than ours, then we have to do something about it. And it starts with educating our kids, all of our kids.
As we place this fight for quality education in a historical perspective, let us remember Dr. King's ability to articulate what success looks like, this idea of visioning that people often need in order to even get involved in the work that we're talking about today. Dr. King famously said, and most folks can quote this, that his vision for America was a place where little Black boys and Black girls would be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. This idea that there's a unity there, there's a commonality about the future and how we walk together, and that one cannot progress if the other one is not in the idea that success is communal. To everyone, what does success look like? What does this world with a quality or high quality education look like for students, for educators, for parents and societies, specifically those who are saying, why should I get involved in this fight, if at all? What is the vision? What is the long-term view of what our states, what our country could look like if these fights are successful?
Well, from my vantage point, I'm sorry, Justice.
I was just going to say, from my vantage point, it looks like an education that provides every individual child the education they need to succeed. It empowers teachers. It empowers parents to have a voice that they don't have today. It empowers teachers to have a voice that they don't have today. And it puts teachers in the position to fulfill the role that they got into teaching to do. And that is to ensure that children actually learn. And we believe here in Minnesota that our constitutional provision will do just that. And I would just note, our provision isn't anti-union. It's certainly not anti-teacher. It's pro-children and ensuring that every child, every single child, Black children, white children, able-bodied, disabled, poor, rich, every child receives an education that will allow them to achieve their fullest potential.
I would agree with that, with every word of that. I am pro-teacher, I am pro-union, but I'm also pro-kid. And what I would add is that, in addition, is that, you know, again, we have to make the investments necessary to realize what the justice just shared. And I believe that for poor kids, we're going to have to make more investment. I tell people, they start off behind, and we need to make and compensate for that. That's the key. And those kids, no matter what zip code they live in, ought to be able to have the same shot at success. Not necessarily a result, but at success. And they don't have that right now. And so, from my vantage point, I think it's important. Again, I want to acknowledge the Progressive Policy Institute, because I think progressives need to have this policy. I can tell you that too many of them make excuses, talk about income inequality, and don't make the connection between the fight for civil rights in our schools is the fight to make sure that our kids have a shot, so that we don't have the chasms between wealth and poverty that we have in this country today, that reflect in very large part at the bottom, poor people and mostly of color, and wealthy people and mostly not.
Dr. Nogueira.
Yeah, I'm glad, Curtis, that you keep bringing Dr. King back up, because it's important to remember that before he was murdered, he was about to lead a major effort to address poverty in this country, because he understood very clearly that civil rights without economic rights could continue to perpetuate the kind of inequities we see today. And so I want to agree with Mayor Villaraigosa that because poverty is an educational issue, hungry kids don't do well in school. And we have hunger in America. We have kids who have basic needs, who need eyeglasses, for example, and therefore have trouble reading. Basic needs that are ignored. There's a great commentary and a number of questions in the panel here if you leave it to the states, we have a history, and we're seeing it enacted right now. We have states adopting laws that will make it illegal to teach the history that Justice Page has described, because it'll say it'll hurt the feelings of white kids. This is what's happening right now in America. If you left it to some states, the inequities will not be touched. So the federal government also has to play a role to ensure there is an adequacy standard. But beyond that, we have to recognize there's not a single state in the country that has organized itself to actually help schools. So when they see a school struggling, the most they'll do is sanction that school, threaten to take over that school or district, but where's the help? We across the country, and these are mostly in poor communities, districts have been taken over and they've not improved, because all the state does is apply pressure and threats. It does not invest in providing the supports to improve the quality of those schools. That's what's done in Canada. And that's why Canada has a world-class system compared to us, because they understand you have to build capacity in schools to meet the needs of the kids. And I'll finally say this, because we're gonna face a teacher shortage in this country very soon, because this job has become undoable and unattractive. And so the threats against teachers and the pressures on teachers are real. And if we don't find ways to make that job attractive, this whole enterprise of education is in trouble.
Dr. Nogueira, Dr. King said, what good is having the right to sit at the lunch counter if you can't afford the burger? What good is having the right to sit at the lunch counter if you can't read the menu? And so there are definite connections. We had about 10 minutes left. I want to go back to the audience one last time and ask you a very direct question. If this ballot initiative was in your state, would you vote in favor of a constitutional amendment to a quality public education in your state? Yes or no? This idea, contrary to popular opinion, there was not universal support for Dr. King or his strategy. And this has come up during the holiday, people misinterpreting, people really trying to, advocate against many of the things that he stood for while, invoking his name on holidays. For some, the comfort of status quo is actually more security than the uncertainty of change. And so again, what happens if nothing changes? What does acceptance of a mere adequate public education look like for our children moving forward? Play this forward. Say we shut this Zoom off, nothing changes. Let's just play this forward. What does a world with only an adequate education look like, particularly for Black and brown children in this country?
Well, we know what it looks like today.
Yeah.
And it's going
We
to go
already see
downhill,
it.
and it's going to go downhill from there. It's not going to get better.
That's right. Who do we incarcerate? Those we fail to educate disproportionately. So we already see the consequences of a failure to educate our people in the inequities of our society.
And with COVID and the 2 years that these kids have not, particularly in LA, have not really had, in classroom experience, it's only going to get worse.
And, Dr. King wrote about the fierce urgency of now, that tomorrow is today. And tomorrow is for sure today for the kids that Mayor Villaraigosa was just talking about. This discussion has resonance, I think, also because we're at the greatest inflection point in modern American history for public education, that we are having to decide in real time as we send our kids back into school, are we going to rebuild a racist status quo ante that perpetuates these results because, as Justice Page said, it's designed to? Or are we going to actually hit the reset button and fundamentally rethink and reimagine and reinvent, as the title of this discussion is, public education grounded just in what's good for students, especially students of color? That's the question that is not existential today. And if we miss this opportunity, if we let this slip through our fingers, it's on us. We will have locked in the inequities that we are talking about for a whole new generation of kids. That's the fierce urgency of now, I think, at least for me.
So
as we celebrate King Week, let me just say, we've all mentioned the letters from a Birmingham jail and various other references. The one I used was the drum major instinct, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaks about the drum major instinct being, wanting to be at the head of the parade, wanting to be the one. We all ought to harness, as he says, the drum major instinct and get ahead of the movement to declare education a high quality education, a civil right for all of our kids. If we want to address the inequities in our, the inequality in our system and the inequality, we're number 16th, by the way. The last time I looked, OECD, starting at the bottom and getting to the top. We used to be at the top. And in no small part because our kids aren't making it in the numbers that they need to. And with respect to, you don't have to be for this constitutional right to, at a minimum, take on the fight, to address today what's happened to our kids under COVID, where they've been disproportionately impacted in a way that they're going to need disproportionate resources to get them back to where they need to go, so that they don't end up, as Pedro said, in a prison, and instead in the White House or your house, successful, all the people here.
Justice Page, you wanted to answer that as well?
Well, at the end of the day, this is about justice. Education.
Yes, it is.
And educational justice is linked to health justice, housing justice, social justice, racial justice. Those are all linked. And if we are going to bend the moral arc of the universe, as Dr. King suggested, we have to ensure that every child has an education, the opportunity for an education, which will allow them to fulfill themselves. Because every child that gets left behind, they're a diminished taxpayer, they're a diminished employee, They're a diminished contributor to our community and indeed likely to become a burden on our community. That does not have to be. We have the power to empower children, to put children first, to ensure that their future and all of our futures are better than our past.
Our final question is about time. And the letter from a Birmingham jail is referenced, has been referenced a few times. And that letter, in many ways, was to white moderates, particularly clergy, who told Dr. King to wait.
Mhm.
And Dr. King said, time can be used constructively or destructively. Because we mentioned, we know what the world looks like now. And I think some of us said it could get worse. So how can it get worse for Black and brown children, poor children? It can. And in some cases, COVID showed that it has. And so waiting doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get better if in time. And so the final question we have, and before we go to the final question, I do want to see the survey results about those who would vote. And so 94% of those respondents said, I would vote yes. And so politicians who are listening, if you send this to the people, the people will speak. What is and this is the sort of the final point that I want you all to sort of end on as we go around. What is the message? Why should why should this case be made now, this post-COVID America, this, to Dr. Nguyen's point, this potential big quit world of teaching? Why is this fight for a constitutional right to a quality public education so timely in 2022? I want to start with Linda on this one.
I think we've definitely seen examples of parents playing a much larger watchdog role in advocating for changes in their communities, especially around how their school districts are using relief funds. These campaigns for a civil right to a quality education could certainly build on that energy and that interest at this time.
Ben?
I mean, yeah, I think to what Linda said, I've experienced this both as a public school parent myself, a privileged public school parent, as well as an advocate who has done community organizing in communities where people like me don't generally live. And I think now more than any time I've ever seen, parents are organizing across race, socioeconomic status, geography, ideology, and other traditional lines of difference because they're recognizing they have more in common with each other than they do with the defenders of an unjust status quo. That creates a political opportunity. It's manifests itself in organizing. I've seen firsthand on the ground. It's manifested itself in organizing that we saw in the electoral results recently in Virginia. And I think that has created a moment where instead of going to politicians and saying, please, please, please do the right thing, we can go to politicians and say, you want to win or lose, you're going to have to stand with parents. And that's different.
Mayor?
I hope that's true. I really do. I'm committed to this fight, and my hope is that people will, become drum majors if they believe that America needs to address inequality and poverty, if they believe that we incarcerate too many people per capita as we do than anywhere in the world, if they believe that we need change, it starts with education as a civil right. Let's give everyone, let's make the founding fathers' articulated statement about all men being created equal a reality, except include women, people of color, all of us. And it starts with the right to that American dream that we talk about and that we're so proud of, and doesn't exist in the way that we say it does, and certainly in the way that it may have. So from my vantage point, it's time to get to work.
Dr. Nogueira, why now?
Education is our best resource for creating a better future. If you're worried about climate change, you're worried about homelessness, you're worried about crime, then we got to invest in education.
Yep.
We got to make sure that all kids, regardless of their backgrounds, get an education. This is a different kind of right, though. We haven't talked about that. Unlike the right to free speech or the right to bear arms, this is an entitlement. This is basically America saying every child is entitled to a quality education, and we're going to put the resources behind it. Think about how many people in this country became rich during the pandemic. We talk about the impoverishment. Let's talk about the wealth generated. What's the responsibility of those with wealth to create a better future for the rest of us? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have a responsibility, and hoarding wealth is, I think, a key part of our problem as a nation, as a world.
Justice Page, last word, why now?
We have the opportunity to be the founding fathers and mothers of the future. If not now, when? And to think back to a past life, somebody once said, the future is now. The future is now.
The children can no longer wait.
Well, Justice Page, I will say you've given me my first webinar goosebumps when you said we are the founding fathers of the future. I get emotional when you said that.
Fathers and mothers.
And mothers,
Yeah.
because that is an empowering speech to us to know we are not, we are we are those we've been waiting for. We're the ones we've been waiting for. No one's going to come save our system. We have to do it. Thank you so much to my panel, to those who listened in. For those of you who watched and said, what about me? What about my state? How do I get involved? We are having a part 2 to this discussion on February 2nd at 1 p.m. And we're going to speak with the foot soldiers on the ground in these states and around the country who are making the case for a quality education as a civil right. So mark your calendars again, Wednesday, February 2nd at 1 p.m. We're going to have another set of speakers who are actually on the ground making the case to parents and teachers and policymakers. What does the fight look like on the ground? So we have a link in the chat that you can register for that event, even right now, that you can rejoin us in the first week of Black History Month, where we tell the world the movement is still here. The movement for education, the movement for civil rights, the movement for quality education in this country is still here. Please join us February 2nd, 1 o'clock. See you then. Thank you to my panel. Thank you all who listened. You all have a great day. My name is Curtis Valentine. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kurt. Thank you, and to the Progressive Policy Institute as well.
This is great.